Welcome to OTA Live, where we spotlight the brightest minds and stories that matter. Let's make change happen together.
Very nice to see you.
Dame Sharon, an absolute delight to see you today on rather a wet and cold
I know, I haven't really. I've got training shoes and like my summer skirt, which is a kind of an indication of the kind of British summer weather.
You look fantastic, and it's a real delight to have you. You hail from East London and you were born and raised in Leyton. Your parents came to the UK from Jamaica in the 1950s and were part of the young Windrush generation. Can you share that experience, your experience, and shed light on how your upbringing unfolded during those formative years?
Gosh. First of all, it's fantastic to be here. I have a 19-year-old son, and my mother was 19 when she came in the late 50s from Jamaica to the UK. And I now think my son is a baby. He can like barely tie up his shoelaces. He can just about make his breakfast. And my mum emigrated, I think, like lots of people in the Windrush generation, thinking they were going to do like 5 years, send some remittances and go home. And she and my dad, whom she met here, they never really went back, even though they talk about Jamaica as home. And so I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and in some ways I was hugely lucky. So neither of my parents really completed school. My mum was very unlucky in that she was the eldest of 9, and then she was followed by 5 boys, which basically meant every time her mother had a baby, she had to sort of come out of school and look after her younger sibling. And so my mum kind of basically left school when she was about 11. My dad did a little bit better, so went to school till he was about 14 or 15. And so for me, growing up, there were 2 big strands, I guess. The fact that I was able to go to school, and the fact that I was able to go to school until I was 18, like I was the kind of gratitude for that, because it was an opportunity my parents never had. And I went to amazing schools in East London. And I guess the second big stream for me is that, which we may have a debate on tonight, is that kind of weird sense of belonging and who's your tribe and who's your community. So I knew that I was in some ways almost a kind of observer in my life. So there were no other black people on my street. My dad didn't want to live with any other Jamaicans. So we kind of lived in a part of East London. My dad's a very interesting person. So there were no black people on my street. There were maybe 2 black girls in my class. So I've got used to, I guess, adapting and being with communities that are very different from my own. So I guess gratitude, but also that sense of kind of where's really home, I guess.
Understood. And you talk about the importance of education, and after attending Connaught School for Girls, you pursued your higher education at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, where you obtained a BA degree in economics and then subsequently earned an MSc in economics from UCL here in London. How did your early educational experience or experiences influence your aspirations for further academic pursuits? How important was it all?
It's a great question. I mean, I was a kind of really odd, serious, quite nerdy teenager. So, there might have been people out kind of clubbing, and I was reading encyclopedias, I was going to church, I was, it's quite a religious background. I had all these kind of aspirations of going off to save the world. And so education was almost my, salvation seems too strong. I was much happier at school than I was at home. And I did well at school. I had lots of friends. It was a really kind of strong form of validation. And I knew, my dad and I used to watch the Oxford-Cambridge boat race. I told you I was quite a weird child when I was kind of 5 or 6. And we always supported Cambridge because it was closer to East London. And so I know, I tell you, it's like Constable, it's like 50 miles up the road. And so I always wanted to go to Cambridge. And I know it sounds, in a way, I now look back and think, that was a slightly sort of eccentric ambition. I always wanted to go, even though culturally, and my school, in my year, 2 other girls went to Cambridge, one of whom was actually now the first person to be a first black woman head of a college in Cambridge. I mean, I knew it was going to be a culture shock, and it was the most extraordinary culture shock. And in some ways, it gave me confidence because academically, I kind of felt that I could sort of hold my own. But, you know, there were hardly any women, let alone any black British people. There were probably 6 or 7 black British-born people that I met in 3 years at Cambridge, without exaggeration. There were 300 of us studying economics, and maybe 20 women. So that sense of, I don't know whether you call it difference or ability to shapeshift or adjustment, I don't know. But for me, I'm the sort of personality that I gained confidence from it, rather than a sense of feeling necessarily an outsider.
And that confidence, of course, enabled you to start your professional career in the British Civil Service, and that was back in 1989.
I know.
Not that long ago.
I'm going to start saying
Dame
it's
Sharon, I am
like
older than you.
2000. I'm just going to start lopping off some years at some point.
We can do it together. But that British Civil Service, and that was back in 1989, and working at the Treasury and then later for the British Embassy in Washington. I just wondered if you could share some specific experiences from your time working in those various governmental departments, and what challenges and opportunities did you encounter while leading in the public sector?
Oh gosh. So I spent 25 years as a civil servant. So I worked under the Thatcher government, I worked under the Major government, I worked under Tony Blair when I worked quite closely with him, and then I worked under a coalition government. So I've been a sort of impartial civil servant, public service servant for 25 years, and I loved it. And that's partly about my kind of value system. Yeah. So until I joined the John Lewis Partnership, I never had any interest in joining the private sector and joining business, because it just wasn't, it's not where my sphere of interest lay. I was always interested in, you know, how do you make the NHS work better? What's the right rate of tax? Why are some countries more equal than others? So those are the kind of questions that I'm really interested in. And I was very lucky, very fortunate, because I got to work on some big, interesting questions alongside mostly some very good politicians at very sort of key moments. And I think the thing with the civil servant, and some of you, maybe most of you, are sort of outside the public sector, the issue in terms of leadership is that you're sitting there alongside a politician. And so you've got this sort of dual accountability. And so particularly as I got more senior and much more interested in how do you create healthy organisations and more inclusive organisations and more talent, doing that with a supportive politician was always easier than doing it with a politician. God knows how over the last few years, where some of these issues have become very sunk into the culture wars. But I got very energised by how do you ensure that you take the serendipity out of social mobility? How do you create opportunity as a matter of right, as opposed to a matter of accident and serendipity, which have been a bit of a feature of my life.
Fantastic. And I mentioned right up front that you then became the first black person to be a permanent secretary at HM Treasury. That was a major step. And why do you believe that diversity and inclusion are crucial to leadership positions? And maybe share some thoughts on breaking those barriers and fostering an inclusive working environment, particularly in the public sector, which, as you say, was the home ground for you.
I mean, it's funny, I never thought about breaking barriers until people told me I was breaking barriers. I think you just think about how the ambition to do more and the ambition to have sort of more influence and more impact. I mean, I don't particularly like the words diversity and inclusion, because I think sometimes these things become acronyms and they come a bit sort of polarised and a bit almost weaponised. But I grew up and went to a school where actually the majority of my sixth form could have gone to Cambridge, but didn't necessarily have the confidence or the cultural code breaking or parental support. I went to school with friends who basically got married off when they were 16. I worked with friends whose aspiration, this is not a criticism, but whose aspiration, they were bright, brilliant girls whose aspiration in life was to be a nursery nurse for 2 years, get married and have kids. And so I guess the thing I've always been passionate about is just how do you get more opportunity in spaces where the light's not shining? And I mean, we can talk maybe even about my current job. So how do you look in those spaces that perhaps somebody who didn't have my background wouldn't be looking? When somebody shows me a shortlist that kind of has the same kind of set of thinking and the same backgrounds, my instinct is I'm not going to hire from this. Yeah. And you push and you pull and you push and you have a stronger team. So whatever the language is, it's about how do you just have more brilliant people around the table when all of us, whether it's how do we make more money or how do we fix the NHS, have got knotty problems that have got no straightforward and no simple solution.
Well, that's extremely well said. And then, of course, you made the transition out of that public sector Ofcom into the John Lewis partnership. And I'm very keen to understand the nature of the challenges and opportunities that you then face moving from the public sector to the private sector. And how did this transition shape your own leadership approach?
Yes.
What approach is?
Yeah, I don't know how many people shop with us, John Lewis or Waitrose. Yay. Those who don't, you can't leave. You heard the message about not going to the loo without a security guard. Okay. You can't leave Google until you sign on to Okay, we're going to do that. It's interesting because the partnership actually has a history and had a history of lots of people who came from the public sector and indeed the armed forces deep into our history. And actually culturally there is I sometimes say that if the public sector ran a business, it would be a bit like the John Lewis Partnership. So we have a kind of constitution or a mandate which forbids us from maximising profit. So we're not allowed to maximise profit. You might be able to tell at the moment we're not making enough money anyway. But so the Constitution says the whole job is to make enough money to do good by our customers, by our partners who own the business, and by our local communities. So for me, the values of the business, and it's been really hard. It's been the best thing I've done and the hardest thing I've done. But the values of the business, which is to do great customer service, but essentially to try to give back to the communities. We operate as a democracy. So I'm called the chairman, but I'm actually the chief trustee. I'm the guardian or the parent or the custodian of the model, which is that the business is owned by everybody who works there. And so it's a very consensual form of decision making. How we fund the business, what the purpose of the business, all those things are taken by votes by our council, and Josie, my great friend and colleague who's a council member, is here tonight. So for me, the mode of operating in the business has been very similar to in some ways to my previous role. I think the thing, other than the fact that COVID hit 5 weeks after I joined the business and, we had a cost of living crunch, I think the real challenge from a personal point of view has been, it's by far been the most public role I've had. Mm. And I was, I don't know if the word unprepared or naive, I've definitely been surprised. I mean, there's a lot of positivity around it because everybody wants the business to do well, and it's very public, but it's been a very public role, and so resilience and making sure you're taking the right decisions without being swayed by the noise has definitely been something I've grown into over the last last couple of years.
Fantastic, and we should congratulate you on a fabulous job operating, as you say, for a unique organisation, employee-owned, a fundamentally different culture,
Yes.
value set than most in the private sector. I think that was very interesting what you said about its alignment with the public sector. Some organisations may view diversity, equity and inclusion, DE&I, as a mere checkbox activity. And I wondered if you could share instances of particular initiatives, maybe within both public and private sector that you've worked in, where you've advocated to enhance D&I within the organisations that you've overseen, and perhaps demonstrating the impacts that in two have exceeded your expectations.
Yeah, and I can't bear the language around tick box. It's just the whole conception of having brilliant people doing brilliant jobs as a tick box exercise. I just find the whole debate language incredibly discriminatory in itself. That's just a side point. I mean, I guess example. So I talked a bit about with the public sector. You've got to do a little bit of a dance with your politicians. The Treasury. I don't know how much you know about Whitehall and whether it still feels like the kind of bowler hat and the. I mean, the Treasury is a very interesting department. It was very ungender balanced about 30 years ago and became progressively more so. And when I was on the board there as the second permanent secretary, one of the really interesting issues was around ethnicity. So actually, if you look at the kind of board measures, something like 14% of economists into the department came from ethnic minority backgrounds, and then you dig deeper. So kind of not completely out of kilter with the UK population, although out of kilter with London. But if you dug more deeply, people from an ethnic minority background were twice as likely to have been to a private school as their white peers, at least as likely to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge, and were 3 times as likely to leave within the first 3 years. It's fascinating. So you had to be, in a sense, more Treasury than the Treasury to get in. You know, in a sense, from an even more sort of, whatever the word you use, elitist school background. And then the culture wasn't sufficiently healthy actually to nurture a longer term career. And so I sponsored, and I have to say the team did a brilliant job. We did a lot of work really breaking down, actually, if I've got a Black Caribbean background, that's really different from having an East Asian background. If I'm from an Indonesian background, that's really different from Vietnam or China. And so again, one of the real encouragements is somehow people of colour are seen as some sort of homogenous cultural blob, and actually sort of really understanding some of the sort of cultural sensitivities, but also the cultural opportunities. And I don't know where the Treasury is today, but we made a lot of progress. And then, and maybe then today at the partnership. So interestingly, the partnership has its roots were a family business. And so sometimes one of the issues with a family business is you regenerate yourself, because there are more open routes if you're a family member, there are more open routes if you're a friend of a family member, and suddenly you realise that the organisation has started to look less and less like to our customers and less like society at large. And I would say, and you know, we are at the foothills with at least starting to have the conversation. We're collecting the data. We're really encouraging. We call ourselves partners to self-classify. We're setting targets. We have a kind of balanced scorecard for the business that's got D&I in it for the first time in our history. But there's massive more to do. And then we've got a very particular programme. So James Timpson, who's just become Prisons Minister, I'm a great fan of. We're trying to do for care leavers what Timpson's has done for ex-offenders. So we have a programme called Building Happier Futures, which started just 2 years ago. 65 young people last year. We hope we're going to hire 350 young people this year. And obviously the cross-section with social mobility, with ethnicity, with class, with social mobility and just very difficult family backgrounds is huge. So we're trying to do our bit, but I would say we are first steps.
In the foothills, as you described earlier, and it's a remarkable programme, as is the Timpson programme.
It's amazing.
Both absolutely remarkable. What advice would you give to other, particularly private sector organisations? What would be the one nugget you would give to them?
I would say, like, you've got to believe opportunity matters, and to hire the best people. And I guess it's the same in all our organisations. When young people come to the partnership, the first thing they do is they click on the website and they figure out what the business is all about, how important environment is, how important inclusion is, how important belonging is. And this has got to be it's got to be part of how you are growing your business and gaining new customers. And those two things, recruitment, retention, and reaching new customer groups with a kind of authentic voice, I would say, see the opportunity, don't see the challenge.
That's a great line. Dame Sharon, reflecting on your recognition as one of the most powerful black people in business, and being appropriately honoured with the Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, what achievements are you most proud of in your career, and how have these recognitions perhaps influenced your own approach to leadership and with others too?
It's interesting. I kind of think the best achievement I've had is that I'm still married after 27 years. It's by some minor miracle. And that my 19 and 17-year-old boys, we have a kind of, well, I say this like famous last words, what my text messages are today. But we have a good relationship. And I do think it's about, like, work matters and it's not your life. And, if my kids grow up to be happy, healthy, kind boys who can work out how they make the world a happier, more safe place, I will feel that that's pretty good.
Fantastic. What a great answer. And of course, you are an extraordinary, I underline extraordinary, role model. And my final and very related question, it's a question that I ask to all our guests on Off the Agenda. We live in challenging times where perhaps hope and aspiration are much needed. What lines of support, encouragement and advice would you give to that younger generation, be it your boys or anybody in this room or beyond, as they start out on their own career path?
And it's interesting, I don't know how many of you have seen the data about kind of young people's attitudes and the gender differences. So young women see more opportunity, becoming more liberal, more progressive. Our young boys, our young men, feeling they're becoming less progressive, less open, more fearful that the world is a kind of a difficult place and a place that doesn't necessarily have their best interests at heart. And so I guess, I don't love to give advice because I think everybody's so different, but I think my encouragement is to really think about those networks. And maybe it's not networks, maybe it's friendship groups, because there are going to be times, particularly if you're a young person of colour, if you're, whatever age group, that you're going to hit a moment that you never thought you were going to hit, or you're going to hit a moment that you thought was 20 years old, 30 years old. I've had those myself even in the last 12 months. And I think having a group that you can laugh with and cry with and bond with and progress together, however your professional career runs, I think that would be my encouragement.
And you used a very interesting word a little earlier, kind.
Yeah.
I presume that would be within.
Kindness, be kind. People will love to work with you, be with you. I think it's much underrated.
Dame Sharon, what a lovely way to finish. Thank you so much for being with us on Off the Agenda Live, the first of its kind. We wish you all the very, very, very best with your career ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.